we go.
Aha. It's good.
You can admit people if you see someone. Okay, thanks, Matt.
All right, cool. All right, so I'll just rehash. Thank you once again for the invitation. Thank you for coming. Today, since my remarks today are being delivered on the week of Victory Day, which is a very important moment in history that we should be remembering, especially now at this point in crisis when fascism is pressing on our future so intensely. It's very important to look to the past at moments where fascism was defeated with greater respect than we do. And I know that for myself, when I'm not that old, but despite that, in the 1990s, while I was in high school and elementary, I remember celebrating Victory Day and the defeat of fascism much more ardently than anything that I see going on in my current world today. My younger siblings or my younger cousins, young people today, World War II means hardly anything. They get certain things in film and Hollywood, but it doesn't have any real meaning, not that has any application to how they live their lives or the type of world that they think they live in. That's a real tragedy. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that that older generation who risked their lives to fight to put down the potential new world order, right? I mean, keep in mind the actual rise of fascism, the rise of the science of population control in the form of eugenics, was something taught in Harvard, in Yale, in Oxford, in McGill College in Canada. I mean, this was a common so-called pseudoscience masquerading as a science of mathematics, a science of statistics that would justify sterilizing the unfit based upon certain statistical considerations regarding, the chances that your grandfather, your great-grandfather had low IQs. Thus, they could say that, well, you have a low IQ, and thus you're statistically probable to produce offspring that have low IQs, or let's say a criminal record. And thus, we could justify sterilizing you now before you contaminate the human gene pool. This is disgusting, but despite that, it was actually, like I said, taught, practiced. This was acceptable to not only to teach this garbage, but to put it into law. Like Alberta, British Columbia, by 1932, already had sterilization laws, eugenics laws. In the United States, this had been done in 33 different states, starting with Indiana in 1907. And working its way up to 33 as a total at its peak in 1933, that were already doing this before Hitler even started. And in fact, the leading scientists who were running what was later to be known as Hitler's Tiergarten 4 euthanasia program, which is also part of a broader sterilization program of the unfit that didn't just target Jews. It targeted pretty much, 200,000 Germans were euthanized far before they even extended that to other ethnicities, Slavs, other Untermenschen, right, the under people, according to this really messed up social Darwinian system of controls. And it was highly tied to this idea of population control as well. Not just cleansing the gene pool, but keeping the level of the pool at a relatively controllable height. So these are uncomfortable parts of our past that a lot of people prefer not to look at. I think the fact that they prefer not to look at it partially has to do with a lack of courage, but also the fact that those who won the war after World War II were not necessarily the so-called allies as we are told, but in fact are many of those forces who funded Hitler, who funded Mussolini. Mussolini it's not just Zelensky who's put on Times Man of the Year just this week as this great hero, but Mussolini himself was sold on Time magazine, which was then run by Henry Luce, who also ran, Reader's Digest, Fortune magazine. And he was a leading arch fascist of America who was selling this as the economic miracle solution to the Great Depression of 1929 through 33 especially. And that was the idea, right? Fascism was going to put food on your table. You wouldn't have to worry about the future. Americans and Canadians were starving throughout the Great Depression. And there was with that despair, a high degree of radicalization. People were more prone to look for putting blame on, and they wanted just some causality. It's them, right? It's that social group that I'm going to put the blame on. And there was a lot of media to direct people's hate to the the unfit that was bogging us all down. The Jews, whatever else it was. There were a lot of scapegoats created to absorb hate, whereas the actual forces who made the Great Depression happen were obviously keeping the attention from themselves. And for here, I'm talking about the J.P. Morgan clique. You know, the pretty much everybody who was on J.P. Morgan's preferred clients list, like Prescott Bush, Calvin Coolidge himself, the president, Andrew Mellon, his Treasury Secretary in the 1920s, who deregulated the economy, stripped the nation of its ability to utilize protectionism in favor of global markets run by, as they won't say, because people wouldn't drink that poison, globally extended private central bankers who want to destroy nation states and thus destroy people. That was all deregulated in order for the roaring 20s, right? Easy money to arise. Sorry about that. It's the French accordion. Now let me just turn my phone off. I should have done that earlier. So what was it? What was it that caused these bubbles to blow? It was a certain day in 1929 called Black Tuesday, when it was agreed upon at a certain moment for a coordinated calling in of the broker call loan. So all of the stockbrokers who had taken out loans far beyond the capacity to repay in order to make, to basically gamble on the markets, which included gambling with people's savings. This overvalued the stock markets by a factor of about 8, maybe 9 times what it was actually worth. And so none of these brokers were able to pay back their obligations on the day that everything was called in. And with the defaults that began, there was an immediate chain reaction default, which was unstoppable, to the point that the markets blew out. I think everyone kind of has an idea of what happened, but I mean, just to re-summarize, there was starvation. You had the greatest wave of foreclosures of farms. Mass suicides arose. People were starving on the streets. The US and Canadian industrial capacity was shut down by over 50%. The biggest wealth transfer as well. So those who were in the know, who had insider knowledge of the blowout that was going to happen, they sold their stocks early. That's how the Bush family fortune, which was then integrated into a bank called Brown Brothers Harriman. That's where the Bush family fortune came from, under Prescott Bush, later a senator and the father of George Bush Sr. and W. So they were able to then sell short and then buy for pennies on the dollar all of the shutdown industries, right? So you had the biggest wealth transfer of real estate, of agriculture. Farms were bought up. Now, were these farms or industries used for productive purposes? You'd think so. If it was all about the money, you'd be like, well, yeah, of course. But in reality, it must not be about the money, because if you look at the actual productivity of US industry, throughout that time, or occupancy of houses, it's not like people started living in those houses that were then purchased, or the farms that were then purchased by these mega players. They were kept derelict. So it wasn't really about the money. It was about something else. So the years of shock therapy, and it really was a shock therapy, made people very mushy, very paranoid, very scared. And with scare and fear, you don't have a lot of space for love and for creativity to blossom. I think we all kind of know that, right? You kind of go inward. And so the rise in Montreal, for example, where I'm based, of Nazism was big. There's pictures you could find of Nazi parades in the 1930s walking all over Quebec with the figure of Adrienne Arcan, who was the Quebec Nazi, very, very closely affiliated with Oswald Mosley of the United Fascists of Britain, and Edward VIII, the Nazi king, who's, people have probably seen the videos of the King Edward teaching the young Elizabeth on how to do the Hitler salute, right? So this was the thing. This was it was going big. Madison Square Garden had pictures of George Washington. There were events with George Washington and swastikas and goose stepping in Madison Square Garden, New York, full to the brim Nazis. So again, it was big. Also, there were variants of Mussolini corporate fascism, like I said, being sold by Time Magazine the whole time. Why didn't that succeed then? And again, if people were actually given their history, if we had actually, this is my thesis, and I asked Michelle to pass out, and maybe this will happen after this presentation a series of 3 articles that I recently published, one of which is called "For Victory Day, Isn't it About Time We Think About Winning World War II?" One of the punchlines is that the events now underway in Ukraine have a lot to do. The reason why it's even happening is because something was unresolved after World War II that was not punished in Nuremberg. And like I said, if you look at those who are pushing fascism as a solution, were also the same figures who were pushing the military coup. Just a raise of hands, just quickly. Have people heard of the U.S. military coup of General Smedley Butler in 1934? No? No one?
Do tell us.
Wow, okay. General Smedley Butler, this is actually a chapter in my new book, was the highest decorated U.S. military soldier in history, still is. And he got tired of being a pawn for the military-industrial complex. So long before Eisenhower even gave it that term in 1960, Butler had written a book called War is a Racket, and he documents thoroughly how he says, Al Capone had jurisdiction just in a few boroughs of the U.S. in New York, whereas he had jurisdiction to run a mafia program across 5 continents. And he goes through the overthrow of governments in Nicaragua and wars in the Philippines that he had overseen on behalf of Standard Oil, Rockefeller, and JP Morgan interests. He names names, and they thought that they had their man. So in the course of the Great Depression, a certain clique of these financiers who had been backing the rise of fascism in Europe. I mentioned Prescott Bush. Well, Prescott Bush was also bailing out Hitler for the tune of about $100 million, which was a lot now, and it was even more then, when the Nazi Party was bankrupt in 1933 when they lost the elections. And the opponent, an anti-fascist named Kurt von Schleicher, was appointed by Hindenburg instead. And Hitler was even contemplating suicide. The thing that kept the Nazi machine afloat was Prescott Bush and Brown Brothers Harriman, which had bailed them out, gave them a giant loan, and let them reconquer basically their losses. And Kurt von Schleicher was soon ousted as chancellor under a soft coup and assassinated a year later during the Night of the Long Knives, 1934. That was the same year that Smedley Butler, the general, was recruited by a couple of representatives of JP Morgan, Grayson Mallet Prevost and another figure I'm forgetting, representing again the Morgan interests. And the idea was to use Butler to lead 500,000 striking World War I legionnaires who would not receive certain bonus pay that they were promised. It was a Great Depression, and kill Roosevelt or depose of him and install Butler as a puppet dictator in the White House in order to impose a JP Morgan, Wall Street managed solution to the problems, like it had been done in Europe. The problem was General Butler had enough. He didn't want to be a puppet anymore. And he played along, got names, and then at a certain moment, blew the whistle, went to Congress, testified in Congress. You could read his testimonies, even though many of them were only declassified decades later. He went to the media, and you could listen to him speaking. Go to YouTube and just type this in, and he goes through the entire operation. The other thing this destroyed the military coup plot, or what's called the bankers' coup plot. One of the reasons why they did that was that Franklin Roosevelt, was one of the only anti-fascist candidates inside the U.S. who got power because of a coalition of Republican and Democrat collaborators who were trying to renew the spirit of Lincoln that had been attempted to be renewed by Garfield, assassinated in 1880, that had been attempted to be renewed again by McKinley, assassinated in 1901, had been attempted to be renewed by Warren Harding, assassinated, or they say food poisoning by eating bad oysters in 1924. No autopsy, though, so... Nancy's gotta be on mute. So there was a coalition that had been patriotic. This was a coalition that had subverted the growth of of a world government that had been attempted even earlier under the 1919 League of Nations. That was sort of the miracle solution that was created by those who had provoked World War I as an artificial war that never even should have happened. Even today, if you try to ask even an expert of history, leading historians don't have a satisfactory reason why World War I happened. It was a war that had no reason. And if you actually look at what underlied it, it was a series of British secret diplomacy operations, secret military treaties that would go into effect after a certain assassination was carried out by a British intelligence-connected terrorist operation called the Black Hand of Serbia that carried out a kill of a disposable Archduke in 1914. So what you have was a League of Nations as a way to get rid of nation states. And the idea was, okay, the cause of World War I and the death was the existence of sovereign nation states. If we could just get rid of that problem and allocate sovereignty to a new enlightened elite, right? This would be the League of Nations. You could have a collective security pact in their covenant. That was Article 10 of the covenant, was a collective security pact. Sound familiar, right? This is NATO's Article 5. One person gets into a war, everyone is obliged to get into a war, regardless if that war is just or unjust. So that was the League of Nations. And you had patriots both in Canada at the time under the, obviously we're all Canadian, so it's important to keep in mind that you had patriots then known as the Laurier Liberals, people like O.D. Skelton, Chubby Power, a variety of others around William Lyon Mackenzie King, who had come to power at that point, and they had subverted this project internationally, along with Warren Harding and the patriotic Americans from both parties in the US, along with the Irish Free State movement in Ireland, which had thwarted this idea of a unification of the Commonwealth, the creation of a Commonwealth Federation. This was one of the designs that would integrate into the League of Nations. And so that didn't work out. So coming out of that, jumping back to our original story, FDR arose as the only anti-fascist strong candidate who ended up capturing the Democratic primaries and then ultimately took the presidency. One of the first things he did is he went to war with the second attempt at a New World Order in 1933. So beginning actually at the end of 1932, there was a London conference, very similar to the Great Reset agenda of the World Economic Forum today. The London conference was set up, it was presided over by the king, and it was designed to bring together 65 nations, the British Commonwealth especially, but also the United States, who would then give up their sovereignty to solve the Great Depression by creating a banker's dictatorship. They didn't say it that way, of course. They said it in another way. But essentially, it was a complete destruction of national sovereignty economically and the giving over to the Bank of England. Oh, can I be heard? Are things okay?
Yeah, we're getting rid of Siri again. Sorry.
Oh, it's all good.
Wanted to say something.
So the the London conference needed the U.S. to sign on to the Suicide Pact to basically stabilize currencies, tie everything to a central banker's control. The Federal Reserve was a big part of this. The Bank of International Settlements, that had also just been created as sort of the central bank of central banks in 1930, as part of the Owen-Young Accords. This was also one of the governing mechanisms, still to this very day. If you want to get a sense of what's controlling a big part of the world imperial finance system, you got to look at the Bank of International Settlements, and it's what's called the Financial Stability Board, which none other than Mark Carney had presided over for about 6 years. This is the thing that oversees global derivatives. So the ticking time bomb that's been built up into our economy as a bubble that's waiting to explode and take the Western economic system down, that's known as derivative contracts. We can go into the Q&A on what that is, but just to say, it's still a factor. So FDR, what did he do? He immediately pulled the US out of all commitments. He pulled the delegations out of all conversations, all participation, and sabotaged the conference. And within a few months, the British delegation had to pretty much say, it's now useless. We're going to live to fight another day. During that same time that he was sabotaging this, there was an assassination attempt. Giuseppe Zangara, an Italian Freemason, low-level anarchist, was deployed, as was often the case during that period. Anarchists were sort of like these little locally controlled terror cells all over the place. I mean, anytime you wanted a pesky statesman eliminated from the 1880s all the way up through the 1930s, there were these cells and cells within cells of anarchists. That was a big deal. Very, very, very similar to the rise of not only Operation Gladio during the 1960s, 70s, run out of NATO, the CIA, that utilized Nazi and fascist stay-behinds, that carried out terrorist operations, both against statesmen like Enrico Mattei, John F. Kennedy, his brother, but also terrorist operations against the people. In Canada, we had our own expression of that in the form of FLQ, the Front de Libération de Québec, which was a kind of like a parallel sister organization to the Weather Underground, you know, planting letterbox bombs, scaring the hell out of the population, and basically driving people more into the arms of the state, which had been increasingly captured by fascist systems. A lot of these, you know, in Europe, you had things like the Red Brigades, also operated by intelligence agencies. The FLQ itself, I recently wrote a piece that, again, part of my book, was run out of a faction of the RCMP, its Special Operations Division, which later became CSIS in 1983. So just so you guys know, the thing that caused the first Trudeau dictator to do a martial law, that was an inside job. That when we had like tanks on the streets of Montreal, right, for a month, I didn't live through that, but I know a lot of people who did, and they're still traumatized by that experience. That was an inside job. That was not a legitimate, naturally occurring terrorist phenomenon. We saw similar things occur in the last 40 years under the growth of things like, you know, Al-Qaeda, for example, right? Where did that come from? Well, that was the CIA, you know, under Zbigniew Brzezinski, using US taxpayer money to basically fight the Soviets in Afghanistan, using drug money too, laundered from Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which were, you know, used as banking colonies by the same people who were earlier on funding fascism. So there's a continuity to history. That's one of the things I want people to just hold in mind. There's a continuity to history. Don't get bogged down by the details I'm going through. I'm trying to paint a generalized picture. So going back to the story, FDR not only avoided this assassination attempt in February of 1933, you guys can Google that. He then avoided the bankers' coup. And at the same time as he was sabotaging this international Great Reset agenda, which always had, again, eugenics as the science of population control as part of the broader New World Order package. He was also declaring war on Wall Street and doing it quite well. So utilizing the power of constitutional government, he demonstrated how any nation state can break up the banks. So the banks that had speculated with other people's money, savings. He was able to force in things like Glass-Steagall in 1933 March, which broke up the functions of banks and made it illegal to speculate with people with the clean part of the useful part of the economy, because we have both finance. Money may or may not be useful, right? Depending on what you're spending it on. And if the money is advancing the growth of, let's say, heroin, or the growth of speculative casino-like activity that has no bearing in the real world that we live in, which requires, you know, like science, technology, productivity of real things that are measurable. If the monetary system is growing, or let's say the debts are growing, but nothing is physically improving, you know that there's something wrong. And under Glass-Steagall, you had a basis to judge where legitimate versus illegitimate economic activity was occurring. Once that division of the banks was destroyed later on in the 1990s under Rhodes Scholar Bill Clinton, which had already begun earlier, that dismantling, the deregulation of the banking system had really gotten kicked into high gear, really, I would say, with the death of Bobby Kennedy and the creation of the floating US dollar exchange rate system, right? Where the US dollar became tied to speculative activity, oil price commodities, very, very much detached from reality. That include also at that same moment, the Bank of Canada no longer being an instrument that could provide loans to provinces or the government for the purpose of developing our economy. That became now just a tool to regulate interest rates on behalf of a central banker's cabal of mathematicians. So the last period has been a destruction of the mind's ability to understand what is real value. And so in the consequence of that, of the loss of Glass-Steagall, the loss of the bank regulation that was dismantled starting in the 70s and only accelerated in Canada, the US, and beyond, we have had now the idea that we have to print infinite money to bail out speculators called too big to fail, to the point that, you know, they have their guns to our heads, they think, to the point that now we have something like an economic market that is at least 20 to 30 times more overvalued in terms of financial derivatives, impossible to pay debts that are securitized, insured, and gambled upon. This is what was already going to blow out even before COVID. The governor of the Bank of England, the former governor, Mervyn King, had given a speech in September 2019, just before a big central bankers conference in Jackson Hole, Missouri, where he said, we're on the verge of financial Armageddon. He was pointing to this. Now, he's part of a coterie that actually wants it because they are thinking that they can control the chaos and introduce, just like what happened after World War I, out of the chaos, they think that they can introduce a solution, which is essentially get rid of nation states and impose new types of values onto human society globally that induce us to think we have to willfully depopulate ourselves, shut down our production of food, our reliable forms of energy. All of these things are, we're told, outmoded, outdated, and bad for nature. And so we have to get off of them and now learn to live small, learn to live with eating bugs, learn to live with less, right? Live with solar panels. Don't have dirty natural gas or fossil fuels or, God forbid, nuclear energy. All of these things are just bad. You should be afraid of all of them and instead have solar panels and windmills instead, which we're not told this, but in the science of energy, it's like going from a 38-inch waist belt down to a 6-inch waist belt. Like imagine that belt constricting, you're going to snap your back. And that's kind of the point, is to destroy the ability to sustain the current 8 billion population down to what computer models, mathematical computer models, have been programmed to say is what is sustainable. The optimal population levels, we are told, are something on the order of something like maybe 1 billion. This is horrifyingly bad. It's not scientific. Reality is not how computer models computer models might be a useful tool, but they are not how you would govern reality around. We can do things that no computer model can do. Despite that, that is the model being used by the World Health Organization. Keep in mind, how did I say that the logic of eugenics was deployed? It was statistical modeling based upon the extrapolation of linear trends into the future. What did that mean? Well, if your grandpa, like I said, had low IQ or criminality or whatever variable you want, you could chart that out using probability statistics into the future and scare the hell out of people by showcasing charts that have like a ton of low IQ, criminally oriented people, unless you act now preventatively to sterilize the unfit, ignoring all of the socioeconomic, cultural variables that are causing people to have low IQs, as if that was even a standard of judgment of wisdom, which it isn't, or criminal orientation, right? You're completely ignoring those psychospiritual, non-representable variables, which are metaphysical in nature. You're just saying, okay, purely genetic, this is what's going to happen unless we act now to control the population. This was the type of thinking that has been underlying COVID, right? It's been the idea. This is the originally, when we all were told we got 2 weeks to flatten the curve, what we were shown were Imperial College computer models with controlled data sets, very selective data sets that were very dubious anyway, being charted into models that would then showcase all of these super scary Black Plague scenarios unless we totally modified our behavior. This had been done since the 70s increasingly with this idea that human activity is causing global warming. And just by taking the variable of carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of agro-industrial activity, and tying it to temperature, regardless of which one causes which, right? We were told that temperature is the effect of the increase or decrease of carbon dioxide emissions, mostly caused by humans. And so if we want to stop this crisis of temperature increase of global warming, we were told we have to radically shut down those things that cause carbon dioxide. Well, if that so happens to reduce our ability to support people, then that's an unfortunate consequence of our obligation, our duty to nature and Gaia and future generations to stop climate from changing. Now, the reality is, for anybody looking at this, and there's documentaries that have been done that are really good. The Great Global Warming Swindle is a great example of just one simple line of argumentation that has showcased a lot of the data, demonstrating that, in fact, there was a sleight of hand in that argument, that, in fact, It is always the temperature. If you look at the longer charts of CO2 and temperature, which do move together generally, you'll always find that temperature is the thing which goes up or down first, followed by a lag of dozens to hundreds of years, which then we find a contraction or an increase of CO2 within the greenhouse of the greenhouse gases. So the idea of killing our, like in Ireland, what is it? Like a million pigs were killed in Ireland this month in order to stop for Ireland to meet their greenhouse gas emission targets from COP26. They killed these pigs, not to turn the pigs into meat, but to bury the pigs because they fart too much, right? There's horrifying statistics like this all over Canada. The farmers in Canada are currently being labeled as we speak by Canadian government studies, Government of Canada taxpayer-funded studies, as the world's biggest climate offenders. You got crops being destroyed across the United States. Hundreds of farmers since last year have been recording themselves being forced to destroy their crops, which they're being paid 1.5 times more than market value for their crops, not for that food to go to market for mouths and hungry bellies. 15,000 kids just died of starvation today, right? Think about that. Is this food going to them? No, not at all. It's just being destroyed. And this is on top of the fact that we've been already doing this with biofuels to save nature, starting with George Bush Jr. We've already been turning 40% of US corn production into bioethanol for gas tanks that we burn during a global hunger crisis. So we've already been accustomizing ourselves to doing this for a variety of reasons. The right-winger, libertarian types think that this is a great idea because you can make money. That's why biofuels, you could speculate with it, you can make money. The left-wing Keynesian fascist types who are big on depopulation think that this is great because you could reduce, carbon dioxide emissions, and so that's great. But in both cases, the dumbed down factions of both the so-called left and the so-called right are pretty much pushing the exact same effects in the physical world, which is an artificial scarcity, an artificial reduction of our means of producing food. And again, when you look at what was behind this, go back to World War II. Prescott Bush, Brown Brothers Harriman, Union Banking Corporation, Rockefeller Standard Oil were all complicit after the US had been engaged with fighting fascism. The US had already gone into the war by 1941 when Prescott Bush was found guilty with Union Banking for trading with the enemies, for providing loans and to the Nazi machine. Standard Oil, working very closely with IG Farben, Fritz Thiesen's IG Farben, who had together a cartel which controlled the majority of the world's petroleum products, were providing the majority of the Nazi machine's petroleum that made Operation Barbarossa possible, as well as their explosives, their piping, their steel production, all the way out through the war. These were groups that were never, not once, ever punished at Nuremberg. So not only do we have, and I didn't even talk about the Bank of England, which provided and ensured that every single state that was gobbled up by the growing Nazi machine, Czechoslovakia, Poland, had all of their assets, their gold that were brought through the Bank of International Settlements, put into the coffers of the Nazi war machine the entire time. So this is what continued after 1945. There were a few lower level disposables who were disposed of for public consumption. I think you did have some honest people working with Roosevelt who really did want to try to crack down on the broader fascist operation within the United States. This whole like fifth column deep state, it's not a new thing. This was already a City of London directed British imperial operation inside of the United States that had been there since 1776. That's why Canada is a monarchy. If you want to know why we have a privy council, why we have a governor general and lieutenant governors in every province signing royal consents, giving royal consent to every policy that goes into play, it's because we still have a deeply embedded, constitutionally protected deep state operation, which has been there partially since 1867 when it was enshrined as law, but it had been there even since 1774 when we had the first migration of United Empire loyalists that didn't want to join the other 13 colonies in declaring independence from the hereditary structure of powers. And Benjamin was up here in Canada for 4 weeks in April of 1776. Ben Franklin was up here organizing his heart out to try to get a delegation from Quebec to be the 14th colony saying together with the other 13 that we will stand together and have a new type of society created, founded upon the consent of the governed, and the idea that that it is the inalienable rights of man and woman that determines the legitimacy of law, that the law must always defend, and that the nation state must be premised around, right? The general welfare concept that was non-existent for the thousands of years that human society had been around under different forms of oligarchical systems. It had always been premised around the idea that there is one sovereign who can give or take away rights. Our rights are just there to the degree that we're well behaved and obedient. To the degree that we're not, we can have our rights removed. That was the philosophy. It was never true. It was always in defiance of natural law. But that's what was rejected by the Ben Franklin grand strategy. And that's what we failed when we had a chance to originally break free. We chose instead to remain loyal to the crown, to remain obedient to king and all of the other hereditary things. And the first wave of traitors to the cause chose to come and settle in British-controlled sanctuary in Canada. That's why we have English speakers here in Canada in the first place. And a whole, tradition of mistakes was built around that. We had a second attempt in the 1830s to have to undo that mistake, right? Where we had the Louis Papineau, William Lyon Mackenzie rebellions of 1837-38, but they were underdeveloped. They didn't, you needed a USA that was in control of itself. Unfortunately, we had a USA that was under the control of a British Wall Street directed fifth column under the form of Martin Van Buren, who made it illegal for any Americans to provide weapons or other support to the rebellious Republican colonists, either in Quebec, lower or upper Canada. So we were left out hanging, high to dry, and Lord Russell and others were able to infiltrate a lot of agents provocateurs and others who undermined these rebellions, killed it in the cradle before it could even learn to walk. And we had another attempt, in 1865, 63, 64, 65, you had allies of Abraham Lincoln who found themselves in positions of high authority inside of the Canadian government, who were vying to position Canada at that time to become a sovereign, independent country, right when Britain was at its weakest, having overextended itself in funding the Crimean Wars, pushing the Opium Wars on China to try to keep China destroyed spiritually, psychologically, and economically, as well as India, because who produced the opium? It was India, after Britain destroyed their textiles. That Britain couldn't maintain its globally extended global empire. There was only one world empire, and it was this was centered in the city. That was the British Empire. It was long before this idea of Marxism versus capitalism was even a dichotomy we thought we had to fit into. It was either are you for freedom, are you for the nation state system, or are you for empire? And and hereditary systems. It was much more clearly defined in that sense, principally, even though people were still confused. So at the time, you had allies of Lincoln who wanted to use Britain's weakness to create an independent Canada. Some wanted to join Lincoln's America. Some wanted to create an independent Canada as a republic. But that was a viable debate. That was a debate worth having. Instead, we had a soft coup that ousted a lot of these figures, these better Republicans. And in the place of that, we had the 1864 Charlestown booze-filled orgy of a month of drinking and partying that formulated the basis of the British North America Act that kept Canada firmly locked under the grips of the Crown, which was only ratified in 1867, right at a time when the question was, will the United States work with Russia by extending Lincoln's transcontinental railway through the United States and up through British Columbia, which was, at that time, an isolated colony, right, separated by like 2,500 kilometers. All Canada was the private Hudson's Bay land, a rapacious, evil institution, if ever there was one, that separated, the four little provinces, the colonies that were confederated on the East Coast from the lone isolated British Columbia colony on the West Coast. And it was everyone thought, even people living in British Columbia, that it was only a matter of time before not only did BC join up with the US, but that the US would continue the Lincoln policy of protectionism, a Zollverein of sorts, a customs union that would then extend that rail through BC into the newly sold Alaska that Russia had just only recently sold, right, in May of 1861 to the United States. And that was going to extend easily through the Bering Strait as part of the broader network of rail that was being developed under, again, Lincoln modeled protectionism under Alexander II, who had just freed the serfs and had just saved the United States by deploying the Russian naval fleet to the coast of the U.S. Atlantic and Pacific as a message to Britain to stay out of the war. So, Lincoln was able to preserve the Union largely because, yes, one, the greenbacks, he was able to invoke the utilization of state-controlled banking instead of having the private centers of banking of Wall Street or London control the economic destiny, as had been the case for 20 years before Lincoln, but also because Russia deployed their military, right, to defend Lincoln. And the consequence was that, yes, people were writing about it. We have maps that I've published in that period throughout the 1880s, 1890s. 1905 was the last time there was a U.S. engineers paid for by Tsar Nicholas II who were deployed to the Bering Strait to do feasibility studies of connecting a rail either by bridge or by tunnel through that gap that would connect old and new worlds under a new type of system of mutual cooperation, win-win cooperation, large-scale, long-term thinking. It was a totally different paradigm of human maturation that was on the cusp of happening until what happened? About 30 assassinations and a color revolution in Russia that overturned the Romanovs, that installed a bunch of anarchistic Bolsheviks in their stead, some of whom were actually well-intended, I think, which disrupted things a little bit in an interesting way. But overall, it was a color revolution funded by the same individuals who were pushing the League of Nations, who killed McKinley, who killed Garfield, who killed Gabriel Hanotaux, the president of France, who assassinated about 300 German leaders by 1923 were killed. Different elected officials on the municipal to federal levels were assassinated by the organization Consol, which was, again, quickly both legalized in 1923, but then absorbed into becoming the stormtroopers, like the actual paramilitary branch of Nazism. So this whole thing was derailed in the form of the global chessboard just being kicked over when the empire was at their weakest, and they were seeing this new age of common peace and brotherhood amongst different faiths and cultures working together around a common principle. This had to be stopped, and it was stopped through chaos. And like I said, those who were wiser than we are today were able to prevent it from consolidating their solution to the problem that they created in the 1920s. Roosevelt stopped it. Thankfully, you were able to get a coalition around an anti-imperial agenda. The Nazi king was ousted under a bit of a coup. There were many British aristocrats who were more than happy to go along with Hitler, even after Hitler stopped behaving the way that they had expected him to. Hitler, of course, had the idea. He listened to his generals. And he said, and the logic was, well, if we have this giant military machine at our disposal, why are we going to be the second stringers? Why are we going to be second tier under the New World Order to the British masters? Why don't we take the master position and let the British be our junior partners instead? And again, King Edward VIII, there's a new documentary on the BBC actually that just got out, was writing letters to Hitler saying, yeah, I'm your man. Just, say the word. I'm back in a second. And he was even advocating, he was encouraging Hitler to carry out bombings of London, to submit London and force them to be re-brought back into the fold. However, Neville Chamberlain, who was also a part of this, was ousted. Somebody who loved the British Empire more than fascism. Churchill, who is very much like Hitler when you look into what he did, was instead brought in to his place. And reluctantly, they had to start obeying the broader agenda of Roosevelt, who had openly envisioned a U.S.-Russia-China alliance that would be the backbone of a new post-imperial economic structure. And you could see the readings at the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire in 1944. The American delegation was at war with the British delegation, not to create their own empire. The Roosevelt faction wanted to create a world of developing sovereign nation states with industrial capacity, so that each nation of the world that were formerly colonized and raped would have the economic liberty to produce for themselves and trade fairly amongst the global family of nations. And the idea was to extend the New Deal, which had also taken a certain form in Canada, and extend that to become a global process, a new norm, that the global military, that the military of the US, which had an engineering capacity, which we don't have anymore in the military. You could build as well as destroy, right? In a proper military. That was going to become a real arsenal for democracy to help India, Africa, develop Tennessee Valley authorities, rural electrification projects. This was happening in Quebec as well, to pull nations out of squalor. This was all subverted. Roosevelt died too early. Again, no autopsy in April 12th, 1945. His allies, who shared that vision, who shared that understanding of this empire, this deep state fifth column, were purged. Some were killed, like Harry Dexter White. Some were just destroyed. They were called red commies, and their careers were destroyed. In Canada, we had our own, our anti-fascists, like Fred Rose, the people from the Labour Progressive Party of Canada, were ousted. Basically, they were brought into Royal Commission hearings under the Guzenko affair, which later turned out to be a hoax with no actual evidence. It was a giant propaganda campaign, kind of like Russiagate. That they were all dubbed Russian agents, and some saw prison sentences of up to 5 years. Never were able to go back into politics or law or economics or anything. They were purged. The U.S. intelligence agency was purged of its patriots who understood this thing when they disbanded the OSS. The well-behaved evil psychopathic traitors, of course, like Allen Dulles, or let's say Montreal's Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, who was behind the JFK assassination, who was an OSS operative, they were okay. They were retooled and brought back into the newly formed CIA in 1947. And instead of having this world of win-win cooperation, we instead had a world which saw the repackaging of eugenics, the attempt again at a new world order that had failed in 1940, 45, 33, 1919. So there were various attempts. It's been attempted many times. And usually when the oligarchy, and there is an oligarchy that maintains a continuity going back a very long time, whenever they tend to get close to what they want as far as like a total control of a dumbed down society fighting amongst themselves, they usually create something which blows up in their faces and they don't benefit. The Roman oligarchy, the Roman families that had turned the Republic of Rome into an empire and raped the hell out of the world for like 400 years, they didn't benefit when Rome overextended and destroyed itself. Same thing can be said for the Persian Empire earlier, or the Babylonian Empire, or the Venetian Empire before they moved to Britain in the Glorious Revolution. The empire screws up a lot. They have a lot of power. They try to keep themselves kind of as opaque as possible, but it's often not possible to do that. And so there's a lot of false theories, right, that they plant for people who think outside the box a little bit, see some discrepancies, and want to try to figure out what the hell is this conspiracy. And so there's a lot of, tinfoil hat stuff out there. Usually you'll find it also promoted by intelligence operations anyway, to just keep people in a controlled cage of, lizard people or whatever. The Jews are behind it all. The Chinese are behind it all. Whatever. There's a lot of scarecrows that are there to absorb our hate and confuse us from the fact that the real center of command, the thing that overturned the elections in the United States in November 2020, the thing that subverted that led the killing of Kennedy and his brother Bobby, and the cover-up, the thing that did 9/11, the thing that did the anthrax attacks as another inside job in 2001. This whole thing that is tied directly to the same operation that burned down the Reichstag fire in Germany in 1933 and blamed it on the communists in order to impose martial law. And so this is the same thing. This is the same thing that the founding fathers of the United States were fighting. This is the same thing that William Lyon Mackenzie King and Papineau were trying in their confused way to stand up to. Our Laurier liberals were fighting against this in the 20s and 30s, all the way up until many of them were, it seems, killed in 1941. And onward and onward. So we have this thing. We have a world which is being pulled in two different directions. And I'll end it here. We are told that the new Nazism, this is the reason why there were no Victory Day parades in Montreal. It's almost, there's no Victory Day parades. In Germany this year, a law was passed to make it illegal to carry a Russian flag on Victory Day, the day that saw, the culmination of a fight that had 25 million Russians who gave their lives to stop the world from being controlled by a banker's dictatorship utilizing fascist enforcers as a new global ethic. That Germany has just banned the use of the Russian flag. They didn't have really anything I looked for pictures of like Victory Day parades in Europe. There was hardly anything. all over North America, there was hardly anything. In Russia, I mean, oceans and oceans of people who have all lost family, relatives. Putin lost his brother in World War II. No family in Russia went unscathed. I mean, the US lost 500,000 people, which is bad. I'm not too sure exactly the number of Canada, but big number of Canadians. But proportionally, this was nothing compared to the 25 million Russians who were killed in World War II and the 10 million Chinese as well. And just like in the case of Mengele and a lot of the Nazi doctors and Nazi war criminals who were absorbed into US Anglo-American intelligence, people like Reinhard Gehlen, you know, Hitler's intelligence, the guy who was in charge of Nazi intelligence, he was absorbed by Allen Dulles and the CIA to run West German intelligence from 1954 until 1969. This is the guy with his entire network, not just West German, but also most of Eastern Europe on the border of the Warsaw Pact countries. One of Hitler's top military officials, I'm forgetting his name now, but became a top dog running NATO's military programs between the 1960 and 64, the years that Kennedy was killed, who interfaced closely with people like Lyman Lebnitzer, who was a character who was fired along with Dulles by Kennedy for being part of a program called Operation North Woods, a program that had promoted the idea to Kennedy that in order to have an excuse to invade Cuba, we should shoot down a passenger plane full of American people and blame it on the Cubans. And Kennedy, being a real human being, obviously flushed that and promptly fired not only Dulles, the second in command at the CIA, to Charles Cabell, and Lyman Lebnitzer, whose contract he made sure not to renew, who became a chief at NATO just a few months afterwards. And what did Dulles do? He ran the Warren Commission to ensure that people would only believe in a new narrative, a new story, that some patsy carried out the killing of JFK. The reality is far different. My wife actually did a series on this. So I'll just say we're now at this place. The fact is, and I've told this to many people who are confused about what's going on in Ukraine or what is going on around China's perimeter too. Like, why is it that you have not only Nazi war collaborators in Ukraine being celebrated today, like Stefan Bandera, as national heroes with monuments and streets named after him, with summer camps being presided over with children in Ukraine for the past 25 years by people who are openly devout neo-Nazi lovers, like, you know, Andriy Perubi, the founder of, or one of the head honchos at Svoboda Pravi Sector, and Azov, Andrei Beletsky, a key neo-Nazi fanatic white supremacist who has become the lead advisor to the military of Ukraine under Zelensky, right? And who's funding Azov? Igor Kolomoskoy, a multi-billionaire, one of the richest guys, an energy baron of Ukraine, who came to power under the influence of people like Victoria Nuland, who was the assistant to Strobe Talbot, Rhodes Scholar, who was overseeing perestroika in the 1990s, who ensured that this sociopath would be a controller of a big part of the formerly nationalized economy of Ukraine, that oversaw its dismantling, that today is the primary owner of Burisma, which we all know. I think everyone who's been following, this is the company that Joe Biden and his son, his disaster of a son, have been using to loot Ukraine. And just, I think something like $6 million was accrued by Hunter Biden being an advisor on the board of Burisma, owned by Igor Kolomoskoy, the primary financier, even though he's a Jew, who runs the Israeli European Parliament. He's the founder of that thing. Despite that, he's also the primary funder, and this is mainstream media even acknowledges this, to the Azovs and the Aidar battalions, which are more than just battalions. These are heavily integrated into the civil service of Ukraine. This is what our own Rhodes Scholar Deputy Prime Minister Freeland is deeply enmeshed with. When Andrew Perubi came into Canada to sign arms deals with taking pictures and selfies with Trudeau and Freeland, this is the thing that they were dealing with. This is the thing that the Canadian military, the Ottawa Citizen, did a big operation, a big series of articles showcasing this, even as late as November 2021, of the Canadian government arming and training Azovs, Nazi swastika, Wolf's Angle wearing Azovs, who had been carrying out a massacre of up to 14,000 people in East Donbass for the past 14 years and threatening to join NATO as part of a broader encirclement militarily of Russia. And also there's a parallel thing going on around China, with Japanese fascists being celebrated as national heroes by the second largest political party of Japan. The former Prime Minister of Abe of Japan has called for hosting nuclear weapons owned by the United States. The U.S. has 100,000 U.S. troops in the Pacific that were all brought in, primarily the biggest influx under Obama and the Asia pivot. South Korea has not only biolabs, as does Ukraine, managed by Metabiota, which is a Great Reset World Economic Forum run operation. Carrying out all sorts of bio-warfare operations that have been ongoing since at least 2010 in South Korea against the Han Chinese ethnic stock. China's been freaked out about this. They've spoken openly. Our media has not talked about this. The Russians have openly spoken about their concerns on many occasions. Our media has been closed-lipped about this, both in the bioweapon labs in Ukraine and in Georgia and beyond. So there's over 312 of these things that grew out of the anthrax attacks, the inside job after 9/11. Again, nobody talks about this. We're allowed to talk about the one Wuhan lab connection that we're allowed to talk about. Nothing else. The other 320 plus US run biolabs utilizing ethnic targeted pathogens that they've been working on for the past 30 years, probably longer, that we don't talk about. But that's, if you want to know what the hell is going on with the Eurasian alliance, why is it that Russia, India, China are increasingly Iran? Why are they creating a new alliance, a new security and economic architecture? You got to look at this history, and you got to look at how they've been looking at the growth of this renewed. This is a world government, not only designed to just create power, but also to reduce the world population. Like I said, number one, destroy the industrial and productive, especially agricultural base of the world, so that we don't have the means of supporting our people, dumb us down as much as possible so that we have no connection to the past, no ability to think about the future, and thus no ability to be sovereign. And those are already really bad enough, I would say. So I would just end it there. That's really the conditions. There is a fight. That's one future. If you look at what are the economic policies that Russia, China, India, other countries, what are they doing? We're often told about the bad things, the pictures from Shanghai of people groaning, pets being killed, horrific images, or the horrific images of Ukraine, right? Of people in Bitchute, or theaters that have been bombed, or maternity wards. We're shown pictures, and we're told by BBC, by CBC, by CNN and Fox News, we're told how to think and how to feel about these pictures and images that are out of context. So we're a very image-based society. We don't really think about context so much. But it's important to do that now, because if we don't, we're going to end up believing that those who are actually carrying out the only viable fight against the New World Order right now are our enemies. And we might even give accidentally our acquiescence to support a war against those nations who are carrying out the type of traditions that JFK or Roosevelt or Lincoln had earlier championed. And we've got our own Canadian heroes that need to be brought to the surface. But for the time being, this is a World War II memorial discussion, so I figured I would keep it on that. So I'll end it right there. If there's any questions, I gotta